Incremental routines. Here's the Wired article from Gary Wolf. Want to remember everything you will ever learn? Surrender to this algorithm, which talks about Piotr Wozniak and Supermemo, the software he created. So I will be reading this article. Feel free to just listen to this video as some sort of audiobook. I want to experiment with this flow. So I will be reading. I may add my 2 cents, like a footnote here and there, because I'm very versed of this content with spaced repetition, incremental reading, Supermemo, or Piotr Wozniak himself. Then I will go slightly meta, because I'm getting this pop-up every single time, and I will be reading this article within Supermemo. Gary Wolf published this article in Wired April 21st in 2008. It's been 16 years. Want to remember everything you will ever learn? Surrender to this algorithm. Piotr Wozniak's quest for anonymity has been successful. Nobody along this string of little beach resorts recognizes him as the inventor of the technique to turn people into geniuses, referring to incremental reading. The winter sun sets in mid-afternoon in Kołobrzeg, Poland. But in the early twilight, does not deter people from taking their regular outdoor promenade. Bundle up with the parkas with the fur-trimmed hoods, strolling hand in mittened hand along the edge of the Baltic Sea. Off-season tourists from Germany stop open-mouthed when they see a tall, well-built, nearly naked man running up and down the Seine, referring to Piotr Wozniak. Cult! Cult! One of them calls out. The man gives a polite but vague answer, then turns and dives into the waves. After swimming back and forth in the 40-degree water for a few minutes, 40 degrees in Fahrenheit, I may assume, he emerges from the surf and jogs briefly along the shore. The wine is strong, but the man makes no move to get dressed. Passers-by continue to comment and stare. This is one of the reasons I prefer anonymity, he tells me in English. You do something even slightly out of the ordinary, and it causes a sensation. Piotr Wozniak's quest for anonymity has been successful. Once again, nobody along this string of little beach resorts recognizes him as the inventor of the technique to turn people into geniuses. A portion of this technique, embodied in a software program called Supermemo, has enthusiastic users around the world. They apply it mainly to learn languages, and it's popular among people from whom fluency is a necessity. Students from Poland or other poor countries aiming to score well enough on English language exams to study abroad. A substantial number of them do not pay for it, and pirated copies are ubiquitous on software bulletin boards in China, where it competes with knockoff like Supermemo. Supermemo is based on the insight that there is an ideal moment to practice what you have learned. Practice too soon and you waste your time. Practice too late and you have forgotten the material and have to relearn it. The right time to practice is just at the moment you are about to forget. Unfortunately, this moment is different from every person and each bit of information. Imagine a pile of thousands of flashcards. Somewhere in this pile, there are ones you should be practicing right now. Which are they? Fortunately, human forgetting follows a pattern. We forget exponentially. A graph of our likelihood of getting the correct answer on a quiz sweeps quickly downward over time and then levels off. This pattern has long been known to the cognitive psychology, but it has been difficult to put to practice use. It's too complex for us to employ with our naked brains. 20 years ago, Wozniak realized that computers could easily calculate the moment of forgetting if he could discover the right algorithm. Supermemo is the result of this research. It predicts the future state of the person's memory and schedules information reviews at the optimal time. The effect is striking. Users can seal huge quantities of vocabulary into their brains. But for Wozniak, 46 at that time, helping people learning a foreign language fast is just the tiniest part of his goal. As we plan the days, weeks, even years of our lives, we will have us rely not merely on our traditional sources of self-knowledge, introspection, intuition, and conscious thought, but also on something new, predictions about ourselves encoded in machines. Given the chance to observe our behaviors, computers can run simulations, modeling different versions of our path through the world. By tuning these models for top performance, computers will give us rules to live by. They will be able to tell us when to wake, sleep, learn, and exercise. They will cue us to remember what we have read, help us track whom we have met, and remind us of our goals. Computers, in Wozniak's scheme, will increase our intellectual capacity and enhance our rational self-control. The recent inventor of Supermemo pursues an extreme anonymity, asking me to conceal his exact location and shunning even casual recognition by users of his software. He is not because he's paranoid or he's misanthrope, but because he wants to avoid random interruptions to a long-running experiment he's conducting on himself. Wozniak is a kind of algorithmic man. He's exploring what he's like to live in strict obedience to reason. On first encounter, he appears to be one of the happiest people I have met. In the late 1800s, a German scientist named Hermann Ebbinghaus made up a list of nonsense syllables and measured how long it took to forget and relearn, and then relearn them. Here's an example of the type of list he used. Best deck vel koop goof kik mek meun pon daus dor gim bek bep ben has. Exactly nonsense. In experiments of breathtaking rigor and tedium, Ebbinghaus practiced and recited from memory 2.5 nonsense syllables a second, then rested for a bit and started again. Maintaining a piece of rote mental athleticism that all students of foreign verb conjugation will regard with awe. Ebbinghaus trained this way for more than a year. Then, to show that the results he has getting weren't an accident, he repeated the entire set of experiments 3 years later. Finally, in 1885, he published a monograph called Memory, a contribution to experimental psychology. The book became the founding classic of a new discipline. Ebbinghaus discovered many law-like regularities of mental life. He was the first to draw the learning curve. Among his original observations was an account for a strange phenomenon that would drive his successors half-batty for the next century: the spacing effect. Ebbinghaus showed that it's possible to dramatically improve learning by correctly spacing practice sessions. On one level, this finding is trivial. All students have been warned not to cram. But the efficiencies created by precise timing are so large that the improvement in performance so predictable that from nearly the moment Ebbinghaus described the spacing effect, psychologists have been urging educators to use it to accelerate human progress. After all, there is a tremendous amount of material we might want to know. Time is short. And by the way, that's my note. Still, in today's standard, 2024, spaced repetition has not made it into mainstream yet, even if it's hugely, massively efficient. How Supermemo works. Supermemo is a program that keeps track of discrete bits of information you have learned and want to retain. For example, say you're studying Spanish. Your chance of recalling a given word when you need it declines over time according to a predictable pattern. Supermemo tracks this so-called forgetting curve and reminds you to rehearse your knowledge when your chance of recalling it has been dropped to, say, 90%. When you first learn a new vocabulary word, your chance of recalling it will drop quickly. But after Supermemo reminds you of the word, the rate of forgetting levels out. The program tracks this new decline and waits longer to quiz you next time. In other words, the intervals increase every time. However, this technique never caught on. The spacing effect is one of the most remarkable phenomena to emerge from laboratory research on learning. The psychologist Frank Dempster wrote in 1988, at the beginning of the typical set concommium published in American Psychologist, under the title The Spacing Effect, a case study in the failure to apply the results of psychological research. The sorrowful tone is not hard to understand. How will computer scientists feel if people continue to use slide rules for engineering calculations? What if centuries after the invention of spectacles, people still dealt with nearsightedness by holding things closer to their eyes? Psychologists who studied the spacing effect thought they possessed a solution to a problem that had frustrated humankind since before written language: how to remember what's being learned. But instead, the spacing effect became a reminder of the impotence of laboratory psychology. As a student at the Boston University of Technology in western Poland in the 1980s, Wozniak was overwhelmed with the sheer number of things he was expected to learn. But that wasn't his most troubling problem. He wasn't just trying to pass his exams. He was trying to learn something different, by the way. He couldn't help noticing that within a few months of completing a class, only a fraction of the knowledge he had so painfully acquired remained in his mind. Wozniak knew nothing on the spacing effect, but he knew that the methods at hand didn't work. The most important challenge was English. Wozniak refused to be satisfied with the broken, half-learned English that so many otherwise smart students were stuck with. So he created an analog database with each entry consisting of a question and answer on a piece of paper. Every time he reviewed a word, phrase, or fact, he meticulously noted the date and marked whether he had forgotten it. At the end of the session, he tallied the number of remembered and forgotten items. By 1984, a century after Ebbinghaus finished his second series of experiments on nonsense syllables, Wozniak's database contained 3,000 English words and phrases, and 1,400 facts culled from biology, which each with a complete repetition history. He was now prepared to ask himself an important question. How long would it take him to master the things he wanted to know? How long did it take him to master the things he wanted to know? The answer: too long. In fact, the answer was worse than too long. According to Wozniak's first calculation, success was impossible. The problem wasn't learning the material. It wasn't retaining it. He found that 20% of his English vocabulary vanished over time. 60% of his biology answers evaporated. Using some simple calculations, he figured out that with his normal method of study, it will require 2 hours of practice every day to learn and retain a modest English vocabulary of 15,000 words. For 30,000 words, Wozniak will need twice that time. That was impractical. Wozniak's discouraging numbers were roughly consistent with the results that Ebbinghaus had recorded in his own experiments, and that have been confirmed by other psychologists in the decades since. If students nonetheless manage to become expert in a few of the things they study, it's not because they retain the material from their lessons, but because they specialize in a relatively narrow subfield where intense practice keeps their memory fresh. In other words, they have natural repetition. Therefore, spaced repetition is not required. When it comes to language, the received wisdom is that immersion, usually amounting to actual immigration, is necessary to achieve fluency. On one hand, this is helpful advice. On the other hand, it's an awful commentary on the value of countless classroom hours. Learning things is easy, but remembering them, this is where a certain hopelessness sets in. As Wozniak later wrote in describing the failure of his early learning system, the process of increasing the size of the learning databases gradually progressed at the cost of knowledge retention. In other words, as his list grew, he did his forgetting. He was climbing a mountain of loose gravel and masking less and less progress at each step. The problem of forgetting might not torment us so much if we could only convince ourselves that remembering isn't important. Perhaps the things we learn, words, dates, formulas, historical and biographical details, don't really matter. Facts can be looked up. That's what the internet is for. When it comes to learning, what really matters is how things fit together. We master the stories, the schemas, the frameworks, the paradigms. We rehearse the lingo. We swim in the episteme. The disadvantage of this comforting notion is that it's false. The people who criticize memorization, how happy will they be to spell out every letter of every word they read? Asked Robert Bjork, chair of UCLA Psychology's department, and one of the most eminent memory researchers. After all, Bjork notes, children learn to read whole words through intense practice, and every time we enter a new field, we become children again. We can't escape memorization, he says. There is an initial process of learning the names of things. That's a stage we all go through. It is like more important to go through it rapidly. The human brain is a marvel of associative processing, but in order to make associations, data must be loaded into memory. Once we drop the excuse that memorization is pointless, we are left with an interesting mystery. Much of the information does remain in our memory, though we cannot recall it. To this day, Bjork says, most people think about forgetting as decay, that memories are like footprints in the sand that gradually fade away. But that has been disproved by a lot of research. The memory appears to be gone because you cannot recall it, but we can prove that it's still there. For instance, you can still recognize a forgotten item in a group. Yes, without continued use, things become inaccessible, but they are not gone. After an ethologist named David Starr Jordan became the first president of the Stanford University in the 1890s, he bequeathed to memory researchers one of their favorite truisms. Every time he learned the name of a student, Jordan is said to have complained, he forgot the name of a fish. But the fish to which Jordan had devoted his research life were still there, somewhere beneath the surface of consciousness. The difficulty was in catching them. During the years that Wozniak struggled to master English, Bjork and his collaborator, Elizabeth Bjork, she is also a professor of psychology, the two have been married since 1969. Were at work on a new theory of forgetting. Both were stepped into the history of laboratory research on memory, and one of their goals was to get to the bottom of the spacing effect. They were so curious about the paradoxical tendency of older memories to become stronger with the passage of time, while more recent memories faded. Their explanation involved an elegant model with deeply counterintuitive implications. Long-term memory, the Bjork said, can be characterized by two components, which they name retrieval strength and storage strength. Retrieval strength measures how likely you are to recall something right now, how close it is to the surface of your mind. Storage strength measures how deeply the memory is rooted. Some memories may have high storage strength but low retrieval strength. By the way, this is how Peter Wozniak, in the two-component model of long-term memory, calls retrievability and stability. Take an old address or phone number. Try to think of it. You may feel that it's gone, but a single reminder could be enough to restore it for months or years. Conversely, some memories have high retrieval strength but low storage strength. Perhaps you have recently been told the names of children of a new acquaintance. At this moment, they may be easily accessible, but they are likely to be utterly forgotten in a few days, and a single repetition a month from now won't do much to strengthen them, after all. The Bjorks were not the first psychologists to make this distinction, but they, and a series of collaborators, used a broad range of experimental data to show how these laws of memories wreak havoc on students and teachers. One of the problems is that the amount of storage strength you gain from practice is inversely correlated with the current retrieval strength. One of the problems is that the amount of storage strength you gain from practice is inversely correlated with the current retrieval strength. In other words, the harder you have to work to get the right answer, the more the answer is sealed in memory. Precisely those things that seem to signal we are learning well, easy performance on rails, fluency during a lesson, even the subjective feeling that we know something, are misleading when it comes to predicting whether we will remember it in the future. The most motivated and innovative teachers, to the extent that they take current performance as their guide, are going to do the wrong things, Robert Bjork says. It's almost sinister. The most popular learning systems sold today, for instance, foreign language software like Rosetta Stone, cheerfully defy every one of the psychologist's warnings. With its constant feedback and easily accessible clues, Rosetta Stone blindly creates a sensation of progress. Go to Amazon and look at the reviews, says Greg Kame, Rosetta Stone's CTO, when I ask him what evidence he has that people are really remembering what they learn. That is as objective as you can get in terms of user sense of achievement. The sole problem here, from the psychologist's perspective, is that the user sense of achievement is exactly what we should most distrust. That's why they call it counterintuitive. The battle between lab-tested techniques and conventional pedagogy went on for decades, and it's fair to say that the psychologist lost. All the students of human memory in the lab, using nonsense syllables, random numbers, pictures, maps, foreign vocabulary, scattered dots, had so little influence on actual practice that eventually their irrelevance provoked a revolt. In the late 70s, Ulrich Neisser, the pioneering researcher who coined the term cognitive psychology, launched a broad attack on the approach of Ebbinghaus and his scientific kin. We have established firm empirical generalizations, but most of them are obvious that every 10-year-old knows them anyway. Neisser complained, "We have an intellectual, impressive group of theories, but history offers little confidence that they will provide any meaningful insight into natural behavior." Neisser encouraged psychologists to leave their labs and study memory in its natural environment. In the style of ecologist, he didn't doubt that the laboratory theories were correct in their limited way, but he wanted results that had power to change the world. Many psychologists followed Neisser, but others stuck to their laboratory methods. The spacing effect was one of the proudest lab-derived discoveries, and it was interesting precisely because it was not obvious, even to professional teachers. The same year that Neisser revolt, Robert Bjork, working with Thomas Launder of Bell Labs, published the results of two experiments involving nearly 700 undergraduate students. Launder and Bjork were looking for the optimal moment to rehearse something so that it would later be remembered. The results were impressive. The best time to study something is at the moment you are about to forget it. And yet, as Neisser might have predicted, that insight was useless in the real world. Determining the precise moment of forgetting is essentially impossible in day-to-day life. Obviously, computers were the answer, and the idea of using them was occasionally suggested, starting in the 1960s. But except from experimental software, nothing was built. The psychologists were interested mainly in theories and models. The teachers were interested in immediate signs of success. Yeah, because the gains are in the long term. The students were cramming to pass their exams. The payoff for genuine progress was somehow too abstract, too delayed to feed back into the system in a useful way. What was needed was not an academic psychologist, but a tinkerer. Somebody with a lot of time on his hands, a talent for mathematics, and a strangely little temperament that made him think he should actually recall the things he learned. The day I first met Wozniak, we go for a 7-mile walk down a windy beach. The day I first met Wozniak, we go for a 7-mile walk down a windy beach. I'm in my business clothes and half comatose from jet lag. He is wearing a tracksuit and comes toward me with a gait so buoyant he seems about to take the air. He asks me to walk on the side away from the water. People say that when I get excited, I tend to drift in their direction. So it's better that I stand closer to the sea so I don't push you in, he says. Wozniak takes an almost physical pleasure in reason. He loves to discuss things with people, to get insight into their personalities, and to give them advice, especially in English. One of his most heartfelt wishes is that the world have one language and one currency, so this could all be handled more efficiently. He's appalled that Poland is still not in the Eurozone. He's baffled that Americans do not use the metric system. For 2 years, he kept a diary in Esperanto, which is a constructed language, by the way. Although an Esperanto was an ideal expression of his universalist dreams, English is the leading real-world implementation. Though he has never set foot in an English-speaking country, he speaks the language fluently. Two words that he used to give me trouble were perspicuous and perspicacious. He confessed as we drank beer with raspberry syrup at the tiny beachside restaurant where we were the only customers. Then I found a mnemonic to enter in Supermemo. Clear, clever. Now I never misuse them. Wozniak's command of English is the result of a series of heroic experiments in the tradition of Ebbinghaus. They involve relentless sessions of careful self-analysis tracked over years. He began with the basic conundrum of too much to study in too little time. His first solution was based on folk wisdom. It is a common intuition, Wozniak later wrote, that with successive repetitions, knowledge should gradually become more durable and require less frequent review. This insight had already been proven by Launder and Bjork, but Wozniak wasn't aware of their theory of forgetting or of any of the landmark studies in laboratory research on memory. This ignorance was probably a blessing, because it forced him to rely on pragmatic engineering. In 1985, he divided his database into 3 equal sets and created schedules for studying each of them. One of the sets he studied every 5 days, another every 18 days, and the third at expanding intervals, increasing the period between the study sessions each time he got the answers right. This experiment proved that Wozniak's first hunch was too simple. On none of the tests did his recall show significant improvement over time that naive methods of study he normally used. But he was not discouraged, and he continued marking over more elaborate investigations of study intervals, changing the second interval to 2 days, then 4 days, then 6 days, and so on. Then he changed to a third interval, then to the fourth, and continued to test and measure and test, for nearly a decade. His conviction that forgetting could be tamed by following rules gave him the intellectual fortitude to continue searching for those rules. He doggedly traced a matrix of paths, like a man pacing off steps in a forest where he is lost. All of his early work was done on paper. In the computer science department at the Potsdam University of Technology, we had single mainframe of Polish Russian designs, which punch cards, Wozniak recalls. If you could stand in line long enough to get your cards punched, you could wait a couple of days more for the machine to turn your cards, then at least you got a printout, which was your output. The personal computer revolution was already pretty far along in the US. By the time Wozniak managed to get his hands on an Armstrong PC 1512, imported through quasi-legal means from Hamburg, Germany. With this, he was able to make another major advance in Supermemo, computing the difficulty of a fact or study and adjusting the unique shape of the predicted forgetting curve for every item and user. A friend of Wozniak's adapted his software to run on Atari machines. And as access to personal computers finally spread among students, so did Supermemo. After a collapse of Polish communism, Wozniak and some fellow students formally formed a company, Supermemo World. By 1995, their program was one of the most successful applications developed in the country's fledgling software industry, and they were searching for funding that would allow them to relocate to Silicon Valley. That year, at Comdex in Las Vegas, 2,800 people got a look at Sony's new DVD technology, prototypes of flat screens, and Wozniak's Supermemo. which became the first Polish product shown at the Great Quick Carnival, then at the height of its influence. In Europe, the old communist experiment in human optimization had run its course. Wozniak believed that in a world of open competition, where individuals are rewarded on merit, a scientific tool that accelerated learning would find customers everywhere. Wozniak's chief partner in the campaign to reprogram the world approach to learning through Supermemo was Krzysztof Bidelek, who had been his classmate at the University of Technology. The two men used to run 6 miles to a nearby lake for an icy swim. Bidelek agrees with Wozniak that winter swimming is good for mental health. Bidelek also agrees with Wozniak that Supermemo produces extreme learning. But Bidelek does not agree with Wozniak about everything. I do not apply his whole technique, he says. In my context, his technique is unapplicable. What Bidelek means by Wozniak techniques is the extension of the algorithmic optimization to all dimensions of life. Bidelek is the CEO of Supermemo World, and continues to be, by the way, which sells and licenses Wozniak's invention. Today, Supermemo World employs just 25 people. The venture capital never came through, and the company never moved to California. About 50,000 copies of Supermemo were sold in 2006, most far less than $50. Many more are thought to have been pirated. Bidelek and I talked in a restaurant in downtown Warsaw, where the shelves are covered in ham and the walls are lined with jars of pickled vegetables. He was an intelligent, somewhat hen-duck expression, like a young Walter Matthau, and his tone is as measured as Wozniak is impulsive. Until I get the information in sleep, he doesn't even know the exact location of his partner and friend. Piotr will never go out and promote the product. Wouldn't talk to journalists. Very rarely agreed to meet with somebody, Bidelek says. He wasn't the driving force. He was the driving force. But at some point, and I had to accept that you cannot communicate with him in the way you can with other people. The problem wasn't shyness, but the same intolerance for inefficient expenditure of mental resources that led to the invention of Supermemo in the first place. By the mid-90s, with Supermemo growing more and more popular, Wozniak felt that his ability to rationally control his life was slipping away. There were 80 phone calls per day to handle. There was no time for learning, no time for programming, no time for sleep, he recalls. In 1994, he disappeared for 2 weeks, leaving no information about where he was. The next year, he was gone for 100 days. Each year, he has increased his time away. He doesn't own a phone. He ignores his mail for months at a time. And though he holds a PhD and has published in academic journals, he never attends conferences or scientific meetings. Instead, Wozniak has written Supermemo into uncharted regions of self-experimentation. In 1999, he started making a detailed record of his hours of sleep, and now he's working to correlate the data with his daily performance on study repetition. Psychologists have long believed that there's a correlation between the sleep and memory, but no mathematical law has been discovered. Wozniak has also invented a way to apply his learning system to his intake of unstructured information from books and articles, winnowing written material down to the type of discrete chunks that can be memorized, and then scheduling them for efficient learning. This is leading to incremental reading. He selects a short section of what he is reading and copies it into Supermemo application, which predicts when he will want to read it again, so it sticks in his mind. He cuts and pasted completely unrelated material into the system, assigning it a priority. Supermemo shuffles all his potential knowledge into a queue and presents it to him on a study screen when the time is right. Wozniak can look at the graph of what he's got lined up to learn and adjust the priority rankings if his goals change. Priorities are dynamic. These techniques are designed to overcome steep learning curves through automated steps, like stairs on a hill. He calls it incremental reading. It would be incremental reading with capital I and R, by the way. And it has come to dominate his intellectual life. Wozniak no longer wastes time worrying that he hasn't gotten to some article he wants to read. Once it's loaded into the system, he trusts his algorithm to apportion it to his consciousness at the appropriate time. The appropriate time, that is, for him. Having turned over his mental life to a computerized system, he refuses to be pushed around by random inputs and requests. Naturally, this can be annoying to people whose messages tend to shift to the bottom. After 4 months without access, sadly, you sometimes get a reply to some sentence in an email that has been scrambled in his incremental reading process. For Wozniak, these misfires were less a product of a scrambling than of an inevitable clash of goals. A person who understands the exact relationships between learning and time is forced to measure out his hours with a certain care. Supermemo was like a genie that granted Wozniak a wish, unprecedented power to remember. But that value of what he remembered depended crucially on what he studied, and what he studied depended on his goals, and the selection of his goals rested upon the efficient acquisition of knowledge, in a regression function that propelled him relentlessly along the path he has chosen. The guarantee that he will not forget what he learned was both a gift and a demand, requiring him to sacrifice every extraneous thing. From the business side of Supermemo, Wozniak priorities can sometimes look selfish. Janusz Murakowski, one of the Wozniak friends that worked as a manager at the company during its infancy, thinks that Wozniak focus on his own learning has stunned the development of his own invention. Piotr writes this software for himself, says Murakowski, now a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Delaware. The interface is just impossible. This is perhaps a bit unfair. Supermemo comes in 8 flavors, some which were coded by licenses. Supermemo for Windows, for Palm devices, several cell phones, and even internet version. It's true that Wozniak is no Steve Jobs, and his software has none of his viral friendliness of a casual game like Brain Age for Nintendo DS. Still, it can hardly be described as the world's most difficult program. After all, photographers can learn to produce the most arcane effects in Photoshop. Why wouldn't more people be able to master Supermemo? It has never been a feel-good product, Murakowski says. And here he may be getting closer to the true conflict that lies on the heart of the struggle to optimize intelligence. A conflict that transcends design and touches on some curious facts of human nature. We are used to the idea that normal humans can perform challenging feats of athleticism. We all know someone who has run a marathon or ridden a bike across country, but getting significantly smarter, that seems to be different. We associate intelligence with pure talent, and academic learning with educational experiences dating far back in life. To master a difficult language, to become an expert in a technical field, to make a scientific contribution in an area, this seems like rare things, and so they are. but perhaps not for a reason we assume. The failure of Supermemo to transform learning uncannily repeats the earlier failures of cognitive psychology to influence teachers and students. Our capacity to learn is amazingly large, but optimal learning demands a kind of rational control over ourselves that does not come easily. Even the basic demand for regularity can be daunting. If you skip a few days, the spacing effect, with its steady march of stealing knowledge in memory, begins to lose its force. Progress limits. When it comes to increasing intelligence, our brain is up to the task and our technology is up to the task. The problem relies in our temperament. The Baltic Sea is dark as an unlit mirror. Wozniak and I walk along the shore, passing the wooden snack stands that won't be open until spring. He tells me how he manages his life. He's married and his wife shares his lifestyle. They swim together in winter, and though Polish is their native language, they communicate in English, which she learned with Supermemo. Wozniak's days are blocked into distinct periods: a creative period, a reading and studying period, an exercise period, an editing period, a resting period, and then a second creative period. That will be slots in his plan, a feature in Supermemo. He doesn't get up at a regular hour, and he's passionate against alarm clocks. If excitement over his research leads him to work into the night, he simply shifts to sleeping in that day. When he sits down for a session of incremental reading, he attends to whatever automatically appears on his computer screen, stopping the instant his mind begins to drift or his comprehension falls too low, and then moving on to the next item in the queue. Supermemo grabs a distribution of priorities that can be adjusted as he goes. When he encounters a passage that he thinks he will need to remember, he marks it. Then he goes into a pattern of spaced repetition, and the information it contains will stay in his brain indefinitely. Once you get the snippets you need, Wozniak says, your books disappear. They gradually evaporate. They have been translated into knowledge. Should I say converted? As a science fiction fan, I had always assumed that when computers supplemented our intelligence, it will be because we outsourced some of our memory to them. We will ask questions, and our machines will give oracular or supremely practical replies. By the way, now with AI, language models in 2024, that's the thing. Wozniak has discovered a different route. When he entrusts his mental life to a machine, it is not to throw off the burden of a thought, but to make his mind more swift. Extreme knowledge is not something for which he programs a computer, but for which his computer is programming him. I already told Wozniak that I am not optimistic about my ability to tame all reading habits in the name of optimized knowledge. Books, for me, are not merely sources of information I might want to lead into memory, but also subjective companions, almost substitute people. And I don't see why I would want to hold on them into fragments. Still, I tell him I would like to give it a shot. So believe me, I'm trying new things. So, you believe in trying new things for yourself? He asks. Yes. This provides his opening. In that case, let's go swimming. At the edge of the sea, I became afraid. I'm a strong swimmer. But there's something about standing on the beach in the type of minuscule bathing suit you get at the gift shop, a discount resort in Eastern Europe, and watching people stride past their down parkas. That's marks of danger. I'm already happy with anticipation, Wozniak says. Will I have a heart attack? There is less risk than on your drive here, he answers. I realize he must be correct. Poland has fewer freeways, and in the rural north, lines of cars jog behind communist-era farm machinery until they defy the odds and try to pass. They were spectacular wrecks. Wozniak gives close attention to the qualitative estimate of fatal risks. By graphing the acquisition of knowledge in Supermemo, he has realized that in a single lifetime, one can acquire only a few million new items. By the way, now he says 300,000. This is the absolute limit of intellectual achievement, defined by death. So he guards his health. He rarely gets in a car. The Germans on the beach are staring at me. I dive in. Philosopher William James once wrote the mental life is controlled by noticing. Climbing out the sea and onto wildly beach, my skin purple and my mind in a reverie provoked by shock, I found myself thinking of a checklist Wozniak wrote a few years ago describing how to become a genius. His advice was straightforward yet strangely terrible. You must clarify your goals, gain knowledge through spaced repetition, preserve health, work steadily, minimize stress, refuse interruption, and never resist to sleep when tired. This should lead to radically improved intelligence and creativity. The only cost: turning your back on every convention of social life. It is a severe prescription. And yet now, as I grin broadly and wave to the gawkers, it occurs to me that the cold rationality of his approach may be only a surface feature, and that when linked to genuine rewards, even the chillest of the systems can have a certain visceral appeal. By projecting the achievement of extreme memory back along the forgetting curve, by probably linking the distant future, when we will know so much, to the few minutes we devoted studying today, Wozniak has found a way to condition his temperament along with his memory. He is making the future noticeable. He is trying not just to learn many things, but to warm the process of learning itself with a draft of utopian ecstasy. That's the end of the article. Hope that was of some value to you, at least my reading. And this article, if you are new to this, you came across this article today, it will be a tipping point in your life. You don't need to apply everything he says. Let me know if you like this and you will want to hear to more narratives, to more narrations of articles. See you incrementally.